Artificial intelligence is a good example of the kind of technology that could only have been invented by Soviet communists to be later appropriated by Western capitalists, and not the other way around. The reason that so much of the early credit, as well as the credit today, goes either to people who lived in the Soviet Union or people who are descended from people who lived in the Soviet Union is because they were so much better at teaching kids math and science than Western cultures are today. And the reason is that capitalism in the Western world is focused on exploiting problems, while communism everywhere, always, is focused on solving problems. And it doesn't always work out that way, right? There are cases where capitalists accidentally solve problems, and there are cases where communism goes awry. The Soviet Union is a perfect example of that. There were lots of issues that came up with the way that things were implemented. The systems were not good. And that's why they wanted to invent artificial intelligence, because it allows you to forecast and predict and plan complex, chaotic systems, which is sort of the engineer's dream, as Adam Curtis put it in his 3-part documentary series titled The Engineer's Dream about this topic. The reason that so much of the credit for the development of artificial intelligence from its inception to today goes either to people who lived in the Soviet Union or to the children and descendants of people who lived in the Soviet Union is because they were so much better at teaching kids math and science than the Western democracies ever have been. Because capitalism is focused on educating children into being good employees, good cogs, good factory workers, where communist education was about solving problems. A good example is housing. We have a housing crisis in the Western world. The Soviet Union did not. Rents were capped at 5% of income in the Soviet Union, and they set up factories to mass produce apartment buildings that they shipped and set up all over the continent. And those are still around today. And people are paying a lot more than 5% for them now. The fact is that capitalism exploits problems and Soviet communism solves problems. And there are lots of other issues, right? I'm not a tanky. I'm not here to say that the Soviet Union was perfect, but their goal was to solve problems. The way that that was implemented was totally fucked up. You know, I will be the first to argue that. I'm not here to defend Soviet communism. It was a problem. There was a lot wrong with it. But they invented these things like artificial intelligence because their goal was to solve problems officially at the top, right? So there were all kinds of examples of people building models of things that could be considered ancestors of what eventually became real AI. But the first actual attempt at implementing nonlinear regression models to solve problems in the real world was all in the Soviet Union, in systems theory and ecology and economics. And the first chess AI was developed in the Soviet Union, Kaizen. All of these problems are still true today, even though the Soviet Union is gone. America does not produce top students. More than half of our postdoc students in the US are immigrants. Almost all of our tech CEOs are immigrants. Almost all of our tech founders are immigrants. Because America doesn't care about creating smart people like other countries do, like the Soviet Union did. The fact is that we don't have education today that compares to the Soviet Union. And on issues of equality and gender, for example, there is so much conversation in the US about how do we fix the gender gap in STEM. There wasn't a gender gap in STEM in the Soviet Union. They had half and half, men and women getting PhDs. Compare that to the US, even today. So the fact is that the history of math and science is a Soviet history. And America was always terrible in comparison. And now that the Soviet Union is gone, there is a huge gap. There is a huge void in academia, in science, in math, in intellectualism in the world. And America is still the unworthy second son in this regard. It is just a fact that the first true artificial intelligence, the first true software that could learn, was developed at the university in Kyiv in the Soviet Union by Alexei Ivanenko and his team. And it's true that even today, Most of the people leading this work are either people who grew up in the Soviet Union or people who are descended from people who grew up in the Soviet Union, or people living in the former Soviet Union. Even this GGML library that I'm talking about all the time, that lets you run all these new large language models on CPU with no GPU and not have to worry about all of the orchestration stuff. You can just download a binary file and run it. The GGML library is published by computer scientists in Sofia, Bulgaria, okay? So even today, the legacy of the difference between caring about exploiting problems versus solving problems, caring about making students into good factory workers versus making students into good problem solvers, that legacy lives on. And that's the difference. And what we've lost as a world is the people who are being taught to care about solving problems instead of being taught to care about how to exploit them.